Hello, and welcome back to Chagpar MD. I'm Dr. Anise Chagpar, and today I have a very special guest, Dr. Rachel Perry. Dr. Perry is an assistant professor here at Yale. She studies obesity, insulin, and the link to cancer. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Rachel, maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and about the work that you do here at Yale.
I'd be glad to. So, as you said, I'm an assistant professor at Yale in medicine and physiology, and I focus on, as you said, the link between obesity, insulin resistance, and cancer. And that comes from my training was in pure metabolism. I trained with Jerry Schulman, who is somebody who's studied lipid-induced insulin resistance. So that means how fat interferes with our body's ability to use insulin and to metabolize substrates, i.e. fuels that we take in efficiently. And through my training, I became aware that insulin resistance and diabetes are not the only consequences of obesity. It also predisposes to a host of other conditions, one of which is cancer. And so I became interested in applying the training that I'd received to really see if we could understand what causes that link between obesity and cancer, because then if we understand that link, then there may be something we can do about it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I mean, we always talk about obesity and cancer, but we never kind of realize, like, what is the science behind it and what can we do about it?
Insulin does a couple of different things. And unfortunately, in the setting of obesity, insulin creates something of a vicious cycle. And so several of the functions of insulin include first, fat deposition. So the more insulin you have, the more fat you're going to put in the viscera, so that means around your organs, as well as the subcutaneous depot, which is under the skin. So that is one thing. A second function of insulin is to help our body use metabolites. So when we eat a meal, we take in glucose, and that is in our bloodstream. What insulin does is it helps the cells in the body, particularly in the muscle, to take up that glucose, bringing it out of the bloodstream and into the cells in the muscle, so that they can then use that glucose and metabolize it. And so, unfortunately, when folks are obese, that second process, the process of insulin's ability to stimulate the uptake of glucose, bringing it into cells and out of the bloodstream, that process doesn't work so well. So what insulin resistance means is that the body fails to respond properly to insulin, and it fails to use it efficiently to take up fuels into cells of the body. Unfortunately, insulin still works to promote fat deposition. So that means that you have the bad effects of insulin without the good effects of insulin in the setting of obesity. And we think that that insulin resistance that I mentioned is a direct result of fat. So fat in our muscle cells blocks insulin's ability to stimulate the cascade of events that it needs to. And so this explains a lot of that link between obesity and insulin resistance.
And it kind of explains the other link about higher blood sugars too, because if insulin is supposed to get sugar out of the bloodstream and into cells, that would lower your blood sugar level. But if you're resistant to insulin because you're obese, then more of that blood sugar is floating around in your bloodstream, which can lead to higher blood sugars and the effects of diabetes. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, that too is something of a vicious cycle, because the body knows that it has higher blood sugar levels and it doesn't like that. Our bodies are well tuned to try to maintain our blood sugars within a very tight range. And so when the body senses that blood sugar is higher than it should be, the body secretes more and more insulin to try to compensate for that. And so that is what can lead to high circulating insulin levels that happen frequently in folks who are obese and insulin resistant. And we think that that high circulating insulin can also predispose to cancer and worsen cancer outcomes. So scientists have suggested a number of different factors that may explain that link between obesity and cancer. And we think that insulin is a leading candidate for that. There are also others like inflammatory markers, other hormones like adiponectin and others. So it's likely that insulin isn't the only one, but there's certainly quite a bit of research that strongly suggests that insulin may play a role. And also, and this is a lot of work that my lab has been focusing on, that it may play a role through its metabolic effects to stimulate glucose uptake. So as I mentioned, insulin causes uptake of glucose from the bloodstream into many different cells, and one of those cells is tumors. And so we find that insulin can increase the tumor's ability to take up glucose. And glucose is very good for tumor cells, which makes it very bad for patients. Glucose is important in a couple different ways in tumor metabolism. One of them is to provide a substrate, provide energy for the cancer cell to do its daily baseline functions. And the other is as a building block. So one of the things about cancer cells is that they're always wanting to grow and divide. For a tumor to be a tumor, it needs to be replicating, the cells need to be replicating and dividing very quickly. And to do that, they need a lot of building blocks. And glucose is very good at serving as a building block or a precursor to other building blocks for tumor cells. And so when you have a setting where the tumor cell is taking up more and more glucose, for instance, in the setting of high insulin levels, that can be a problem for those reasons that I just mentioned.
So if glucose is taken up by cancer cells, I mean, that's one of the reasons people feel that sugar feeds cancer. Well, the truth is that sugar feeds all cells, but cancer cells just are dividing so much faster that they need sugar. And so if insulin is really working to kind of pull that sugar into these cancer cells, the cancer cells are going to divide more. But tell us more about this insulin resistance, because on the flip side, you said that people who are obese, they're resistant to insulin. So is that good then, that the insulin won't work so well, so then the cancer won't have so much sugar?
If it worked that way, it would be a good thing. But unfortunately, it does not seem that tumor cells become resistant to insulin. We've never seen, in many different mouse models of cancer and many different dietary models of obesity and insulin resistance, we've never managed to find a tumor cell that becomes resistant to insulin. So the problem you have then is that many other cells in the body are resistant to insulin. So the muscle won't be taking up as much glucose. The heart, which is a muscle, but and other tissues in the body won't take up as much glucose, but the tumor will continue to avidly take up glucose stimulated by insulin. And so that creates something of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and it's kind of a double whammy, right? Because the other cells are insulin resistant, so more glucose is staying in the bloodstream, but the tumor cells aren't insulin resistant, so they're like, yes, more sugar for me, and can grow faster. Does that kind of work?
Exactly. That's exactly how it works. But, you know, we've found one way that we can interfere with this process, and that is by flipping this and by having animals exercise. So when you exercise, this causes a diversion of glucose from tumor to exercising muscle. The thing about exercising muscles is to fuel their metabolism. They need a lot of sugar to fuel their muscle contraction. And so when we have animals exercise, this takes glucose from the tumor and puts it into the muscle, both because of, well, we're still working on the mechanism. It appears to be partly insulin dependent, may not be entirely insulin dependent. But this leads to very beneficial effects in our animal models of exercise, even without very much weight loss.
So, Rachel, even though these mice or people, I suppose if we were to extrapolate, even if they're obese, and we know that obesity leads to insulin resistance, if they exercise, so now your body is saying, my muscles need glucose. So even though I may be insulin resistant normally, I'm still going to pull some of that sugar out of the bloodstream into my muscles because my muscles are using that sugar. So we better give them something. And so
Exactly.
it kind of drives more of that blood sugar to your muscles instead of leaving it in the bloodstream. where it can go on to diabetes and other problems.
Exactly. And that seems to be, there seems to be sort of a double whammy effect for why glucose is diverted from tumor into muscle. One reason is because exercise is an insulin sensitizing intervention. So you move the fat away from the places you don't want it. And so the animals become more insulin sensitive, even if they don't lose a lot of weight. But in addition to that, there appears to be an insulin independent effect of exercise to bring glucose into muscle. And we're still working on what can explain that. We don't know why that is, but we know it's not insulin. And so for that reason as well, glucose will go from tumor to muscle in the exercising animal. And I will say also there are a number of epidemiologic studies in humans with cancer who are exercising. And it turns out the epidemiologic studies are very clear that exercise is beneficial before, during, and after cancer treatment. It's helpful at every stage, even if people are still obese.
Interesting. So this brings me to the question of, okay, if I'm obese, how does that, I get the whole, if I had a cancer cell being insulin resistant normally, but cancer cells aren't insulin resistant, it would feed the cancer would grow. But if I don't already have a cancer, how does obesity increase my risk of developing cancer?
Well, the thing about cancer is, for all of us, if we lived long enough, we would all have cancer. Because over time, mutations accumulate. There are tiny genetic changes in all of our cells. And eventually, we would all, develop some sort of a cancer. So we could think of it, this is a little bit of a depressing way to think about it, but we could imagine it as though we all have a little bit of underlying cancer. And it's a matter of, not helping that to grow more rapidly.
And so, kind of breaking that vicious cycle, either with exercise or losing some weight, might really help.
Absolutely. And an important point about weight loss is that we don't have to get back to our high school weight. Studies have shown that if you're an obese person and you lose a small amount, 5 to 10% of your body weight, such that you're probably still at least overweight, if not obese, that can almost completely correct your insulin sensitivity.
Wow.
And so that would really, I know it's quite remarkable. Now then that has to be maintained. It isn't helpful if you then go back and gain weight again. But it's really not necessary to get back to what we might say, quote unquote, the ideal body weight, to have a real metabolic improvement and a real reduction in cancer risk.
Yeah, mind you, it's still nice to be at your ideal body weight for so many other reasons, right?
Certainly.
But the other question I have is, we talked about exercise, and there's no doubt that exercise is so critical. Whether you lose weight or not, it seems to have an effect on reducing your cancer risk, as you said, before, during, or after, reducing your risk of recurrence. Does weight loss work the same way? So if I gained weight during my breast cancer treatment, for example, we know many women will gain weight with breast cancer treatment. How depressing is that? Because you gain weight with your treatment that fights your cancer, which only puts you at increased risk of recurrence. So if you lose weight on afterwards, does that reduce your risk again of getting a recurrence of cancer?
Yes, losing weight, but only to the point of where you maintain a healthy body weight, does reduce risk of recurrence. We don't want to get into the cachectic situation. So that is where people lose too much weight and they actually become underweight and can begin to lose muscle mass. That still puts you at a higher risk. But losing a modest amount of weight, so you may go from overweight to healthy weight, is helpful in terms of reducing the risk of recurrence.
And does it matter if you didn't do that so much with exercise? Like maybe you tried to get a bit of walking in, but maybe you really lost your weight by watching what you ate, or, kind of trying to be in that calorie deficit, right? Whether it was with a particular diet or whatever. Do dietary interventions alone work to reduce your risk of developing cancer if you can still get into that ideal body weight as a result?
Absolutely, they certainly do. So there's still disagreement about what the best diet is.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, yeah. We're still working on that. We've seen reports about high protein, low carb, about ketogenic diets, and others. The data are pretty clear that a high carbohydrate diet is not the best, and that's for a number of different reasons. It does predispose to weight gain, make it harder to lose weight. It also Carbohydrates will spike your insulin levels more than proteins and fats. And so to the extent that insulin is involved in driving tumor growth, you don't want to have a high carbohydrate diet to cause spikes in insulin. But whether we go with a high protein, high fat, low carb diet versus a ketogenic diet, which is very, very high fat, high protein, essentially no carb, the jury's still out on that, which of those is better. Intermittent fasting is another perturbation that has been used. I'm not aware of clinical trials in people doing intermittent fasting. There can be some drawback. It would have to be done in sort of a careful way, as I would imagine it, because it would be important when you were not in the fasting period and you were in the eating period. It would be important to not consume so many carbohydrates that you spike your insulin levels, because then you're reversing that effect of lowering the insulin with the intermittent fast. But likely, whichever diet is easier for the patient to maintain and that they can live with, that likely is going to be the best diet in this setting.
Yeah, consistency is key. I mean, everything comes down to really finding something that's sustainable, that's going to be healthy, and that you can maintain. My last question, Rachel, for you is this. So many people who are worried about their carbohydrate load, whether it's because of diabetes or whether it's because of, obesity or whether it's because of cancer risk, will say, well, I'm not going to eat fruits and vegetables because they're high in carbohydrates. So does it make a difference in terms of the type of carbohydrate? I mean, when we look at good carbohydrates versus bad carbohydrates, or complex sugars versus simple sugars, fiber versus not, does that make a difference? Or should people really be watching their total carbohydrates in whatever form they come in?
It does make a difference in what form they come in. And basically what I would say is what our ancestors 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago were eating is really what we should be eating. Fruits and vegetables are absolutely much healthier than the complex carbs. And while it is true that fruits and vegetables proportionally are higher in carbohydrate because they don't have any fat and very little protein, still on a gram for gram basis, if you were to take, a bowl of strawberries versus a bowl of potato chips, you're going to get a lot more carbohydrates in the potato chips, and the strawberries are going to be better for you. So it needs to be something sustainable, but going as natural as possible in terms of how we get those nutrients is really going to be helpful.
Well, this has been such a great video. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk to you, to really kind of get some of the science between how obesity really can link to cancer and diabetes and heart disease and stroke and all of the things that we never want to get, and how insulin really plays a role. Thank you so much for being my guest here today on CHAGPAR MD. Again, for all of you, if you liked this material, please give us a like and a share. Please subscribe so that we can bring you more great content. I am going to leave Dr. Perry's bio in the description box below, as well as a link to a great radio show that she and I did on Yale Cancer Answers. You really need to check it out. If you're into podcasts, Yale Cancer Answers is downloadable on Apple iTunes, and it also airs on WNPR if you're in the northeastern United States. So anyways, thank you again, Rachel. This has been absolutely great. Everyone else, until next time, I'm Dr. Anise CHAGPAR, wishing you all a healthy and safe week.